Welcome back to And Motion, Crowell and Mooring's podcast addressing all things transportation related. I'm Paul Keller, your host, a partner in the IP group of Crowell and Mooring. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks. These are all phrases and concepts that dominated 2024 and are positioned to become even more important in 2025. But what do they all mean? And what are some of the issues that they raise in the transportation space? Today, we are joined by two of my colleagues, Neda, Shaheen, and Jason Johnson. Jason is a partner in Crowell's Privacy and Cybersecurity Group, where he counsels clients on rapidly evolving laws and regulations regarding the use of artificial intelligence and the interaction with data privacy laws and regulations. Jason is known for helping clients find ways to develop or use AI tools while minimizing their legal and business risks. For her part, Neda is an associate on Crowell's privacy and cybersecurity and international trade teams. She's helped put together Crowell's AI working group, where she stays active on AI matters. She also tests internal AI products for Crowell's innovation team. Her work focuses on incident response investigations and strategic counseling. With the help of these two, we're going to try something a little different today. In this cast, we're going to share some info about AI, almost as if we are teaching it to a class or to the jury about the AI technology. Then we'll pivot into the AI issues that are facing the transportation space. So with that, Jason and Neda, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I appreciate all of that. And we've got a little bit of ground to cover, but let's start with some basics. And Neda, I'd like to start with you. What is artificial intelligence? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me today. So many of us hear the phrase artificial intelligence, and that can mean a lot of different things. Generally speaking, AI is a broad field of creating intelligent machines. Machine learning is a subset of AI that allows computers to learn from data without explicit programming. And then deep learning is a further subset of machine learning that utilizes the artificial neural networks or deep neural networks to mimic the human brain's learning process, referring specifically to neural networks within multiple layers enabling complex pattern recognition within data. And so, altogether, when we think of AI, it sort of means all of these things combined.
Got it. That's a very nice overview. And certainly what I heard there was a lot of data, a lot of data, a lot of data, and quietly software, 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 and then training. Let's unpack this a little bit for our listeners. How is artificial intelligence, as you've just defined it, designed and trained?
Artificial intelligence is designed and trained in different ways. It also depends on what type of AI you're thinking of. For some people, when they think of AI, it really just means having set computer algorithms that are programmed to do certain things. There's procedural algorithms that are fully programmed by human engineers. These are expert machines. And then within that, you have the machine learning systems. So today we're going to talk about three different types of machine learning systems, which are the reinforcement learning, supervised learning, unsupervised learning. So reinforcement learning is algorithms designed to optimize behaviors according to human identified objectives. For example, developing self-driving cars by rewarding safe self-driving behaviors and penalizing risky behaviors. Then you have supervised learning, which are algorithms designed to identify and classify based on training using human annotated ground truth data sets. And so this can be AI that classifies emails as spam versus not spam by feeding it different examples. And I think you and I had discussed other examples of this in the transportation context of as well, how that can come up in different ways, which I know we'll talk about later, especially in terms of how it applies to safety. And then unsupervised learning with algorithms designed to seek patterns in large training data sets that do not rely on human annotated inputs. So, for example, detecting anomalies in programs, which is AI taking large data sets and being able to view data points that deviate from the norm. We see this a lot in the financial transaction space. If you have ever received a fraudulent transaction notification by making a purchase that may have seemed abnormal, that's a type of unsupervised learning system.
Okay, well, I appreciate all that. A couple of questions stemming from that. One is at the earlier part of your answer there, you talked about how you might reward safe behavior, reward the system for doing something that is desired by its human controllers. How is that done? How do you reward such a system? What does that look like?
I guess I'm not a computer programmer, but the way that I have read that that can be done is just by having programmers respond to it in a way that's saying this is the desired outcome versus this is the desired outcome. So it's really going to come by the programmers who are specifying the outputs that they want to see in a more simplified context. I guess you could refer to some sort of prompt engineering, but I would ask that question more to a programmer.
That's fair. And so you also mentioned, I want to make sure I got this. I didn't write it down, but I heard you say it. Ground truth. Did I hear that phrase properly?
Yeah, so if you have specific rules for the algorithm to follow, so if there are things that are generally seen as truths you want the algorithm to say this is definite versus this is not definite. That is sort of how it can conduct its filtering. But again, it would go back to the programming to identify desired behaviors, determine what you want to encourage, select what is appropriate, and then be able to allow the system to run and learn from that.
All right. So certainly from both of these, I get this. I get this sense that artificial intelligence, in a way, might be an overstatement of what's happening here. But a computer program is given rules of the road and then is rewarded as it learns that this is what the human monitors are looking for and other stuff.
Correct.
Well, there was certainly a phrase, and Jason, I don't mean to keep you on the sidelines for all this. Anything to add on those points of what our AI is or how it's designed and trained?
I think just one high level point, which
Sure.
is, artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, right? And I think, and I'll get into this in a bit. I think generative AI really put to the forefront this idea that, what are we doing? And like what is AI and like how is it actually taking over, processes and systems? But this has been happening for a long time, right? So IBM Watson, you remember, went on, I think it was Jeopardy and played against all the Jeopardy folks. I think it did the chess game, right? But that's artificial intelligence more broadly, right? And so I think that it is important to understand from a contextual perspective, right? When we talk about artificial intelligence, this isn't something new. This is something that has been worked on and has been developed. It's just that with generative AI coming out, it really put this to the forefront of people's thoughts because then there was, this new information being generated by these machines that an everyday person could use, right? So we're not talking about computer programmers working on the back end to develop a product or a system, right? We're talking about, me being able to go and open up a browser on a web page, ask ChatGPT to like write a paper for me, right? So the generative AI really sort of flipped that switch to where individuals. But again, I think just taking a step back and just thinking about artificial intelligence more generally, it is important to understand that AI has been around for decades at this point, and so it is important that we're having these conversations now, but these aren't new concepts per se.
I appreciate that grounding. And you mentioned it a few times now, generative AI, and I agree with you that certainly the launch of this particular technology and how accessible it has become, it is changing things on a variety of scales. And certainly I look forward to talking about the impact on the transportation industry. But Neda, how about we turn it back to you? Generative AI, a term that we heard many, many times throughout 2024. We're going to hear a lot about it going into the future. But what is it? How would you define generative AI as being, sounds like a subset of AI? Walk us through that.
I know Jason has a lot to say about this, but generally, generative AI is it's really an umbrella term that's used to describe algorithms that can create new content, which could include audio, code, images, text, simulations, etc. And what's interesting about generative AI, though, is that it's really based on predictive modeling. But I'll pass it to Jason to continue off from there.
Yeah, so the the name is in the title, right? Generative is meant to generate something, right? So in the past, again, going back to what AI was historically, right? It's just a software program. It's an algorithm, right? It analyzes data and information just at a much quicker pace than the average human brain can, and it creates an output. Generative AI is really meant to generate something along the lines of, what an individual human can do, right? So that's, I think, when people think of science fiction and artificial intelligence, I think generative AI is probably more of what they think about, as opposed to sort of the old school AI where it was just an algorithm like analyzing and crunching numbers. And so generative AI, as Ned mentioned, is a bigger umbrella term. So within generative AI, There's also something called a large language model. And so large language models as a subset of generative AI are really meant to produce human-like responses to dialogue, right? So these are the chat bots that you see. And there have been chat bots around, I think, for the last decade, some rudimentary, and ChatGPT really sort of pushed the envelope forward. But there's a big push in the industry, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit later as to what impacts it may have on the transportation industry. But I think industry agnostic, there is being a big push from a customer service perspective to really rely more on these chatbots in order to interact with individuals, customers, consumers, and things like that. And the underpinning of those are really these large language models. And so these are just, again, very descriptive data sets that are trained in order to put an output that makes it feel like you're actually talking to another human, right? And I think they're getting better at that. And ChatGPT is just one type of large language model, one type of generative AI. But ultimately, right, where generative AI is going to come out is that it is there to generate content in response to a very specific question or a very specific set of parameters, as opposed to traditional AI, which is really just there to crunch numbers, right? And so when you look at all these numbers together, this is what you get.
Got it. And Neda, I want to get your thoughts on this as well. But is there, when you talk about training, I'm getting back to one of the questions I asked Neda about training this generative AI. Is there a simple way of describing what that training looks like so our listeners have a better understanding of what's happening?
Yeah, and so an algorithm, right? It relies upon data points in order to create the parameters in which it responds, right? So, for example, you could have a software program that its sole purpose is to create guacamole recipes, right? And so what you would need to do is you would need to put information in there around like what choices do you have in order to make guacamole? You have avocados, tomatoes, cilantro, what the ratios are, right? But if the information that you put in is all about fruity pebbles, right? Then what the algorithm is going to generate out of that is not really going to be avocado recipes, right? So when we talk about training and data sets, what we're really talking about is it's sort of a fundamental factual education of the algorithm so it understands what information it has and how to analyze that information. And that's when you get into, this idea where data is really sort of a monetized property at this point, right? Because the more data that you have, the more reliability that the software program has in the output, right? Because if you only have one input of like the type of avocado to buy, right, as opposed to the various different types of avocados, or maybe you want to make one with mango, right? There's mango guacamoles that exist out there, right? So you need this information because it's an algorithm that analyzes data in response to the question. And so again, when we're talking about data sets, that's what we're talking about, right? It's like the amount of information that the program can use, right? And where we get into sort of more of the deeper understanding, there was really these neural networks, right? So the way the brain functions is what a neural network is supposed to be. So in your brain, right, when you're thinking about a problem, you're not solving the problem over and over again each time it comes around you, right? What happens is that your brain retains information in like particular like neurons and neural networks, right? So it fires off that, which has like 8 or 10 different actions or activities that are already bundled together because that's the way your brain is put them, right? They're already bundled together. And so for the neural networks, it's sort of the same idea, right? Is that the algorithm already has like a very particular set of responses that it will automatically have in response to a particular prompt. And that will, increase how fast it will respond, but also it can skip that step, right? And so that step already exists. So it's like a neural pathway in your brain that already, that it's always going to do the same thing every time. And so what that does is that it generates a higher volume of information that it can get through, and it makes things go along quicker. So again, when we talk about training, part of the neural networks, for example, and the large language models, what we're trying to do is aggregate and consolidate in particular areas. So that way there's a fundamental basis that exists for a particular part of the information, right? Because when you're thinking of an answer to a question, just like in your brain, it's not always a straight line, right? You're taking a lot of input from a lot of different places. And so the AI and the algorithm and the programs are designed that way, and they try to streamline that process the same way your brain does by like aggregating information. And so the training sort of starts from the beginning, right? Like how do we make sure that we've got this aggregated information that is always reliable and that you can kind of skip this first step and we're already, partway down the road for that.
I think I understand. Neda, do you have anything to add on that point? I have a next question, but I want to make sure I get your thoughts.
I guess just to break it down from what Jason said, it's taking a lot of information, putting it into a system, teaching that system some rules about the ways you want or the system wants it addressed, and then giving it options of outputs that it has the possibility of putting out using the neural networks that Jason mentioned. Some things I would talk about would be limitations and strengths of Gen AI, which I'm happy to get to, but I think you had a follow up.
Well, I was going to pivot a little bit to take a step back from my vantage point. There is, certainly our listeners will understand that there's a lot of data that go into these systems, but maybe the understanding of how much data really goes into them is still a bit of a surprise. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of information that are fed through these systems, asking, in some cases, very precise questions or looking for very precise data points that, as Jason mentions, get kind of get aggregated in these nodes, these neural nodes, which is somewhat self-taught, perhaps even by the network itself, to allow it to predict when asked a particular prompt what the answer might be to that particular prompt. That the value of that data, the amount of that data, the impact bad or good data can have on your system begins to get more clear when you begin to understand all of that interaction. But Neda, you seem like you have a different approach to that, to explaining this with pros and cons. You want to walk us through that?
Not a different approach to explaining it, but just building on what was already said to talk about what are the pros and cons of that. So, thinking about the fact that because all of these systems are based off of this mass amount of data that is put into the system, you already mentioned bad data, for example. So, what is bad data versus good data, and how does that input affect the output from what's put into the system, right? So, those are all questions that I think a lot of people still struggle with, especially when we think about issues of transparency within generative AI systems. How are Gen AI systems producing outputs? And we think about the limitations of generative AI. So things like hallucinations or biases in the legal context, even or in other sectors, thinking about confidentiality and privilege. If lawyers are using AI and you ask AI a question, how do we ask those questions in a way that is still maintaining privilege and confidentiality on behalf of clients? That's a question that comes up in the legal context. Hallucinations, AI cannot say, I don't know. If you ask ChatGPT a question, it produces an output based on predictive modeling that it has been taught from all of these different data sets that have put into it. And so sometimes those are not accurate. And then you have what's called a hallucination, where it just invents an answer. Bias is another big issue because AI is only, it only knows what we've taught it. And if you look at history of information, there's a worry that historical biases get put into these systems and then it cannot look forward to create more equitable systems moving forward. So the issue of bias becomes really critical. But at the same time, there's a lot of strengths to generative AI. It makes things, much more efficient, much more effective. It can be a way to just optimize your time. It's easy to learn, easy to use. You can get through a dozen more admin tasks to focus on other more substantive tasks. There's just so many other strengths to it as well. But being aware of the limitations and the strengths, I think, is really important. Jason, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, it just points on two of the things you mentioned on the hallucinations part. I think it's important to understand, and I know we've had conversations about this with other folks, and I think groups like ChatGPT are trying to change this. But in the beginning, right, when you ask generative AI a question, and this kind of goes back to my guacamole example, it would never say no, right? It would answer the question. And I think this is where it gets really important to make sure that people understand that when something gets generated by generative AI, it's answering the question with the information that it has available, which is why training is such an important thing, right? Because if it's not trained on information to be able to answer the question, you shouldn't be answering that question, right? The other thing to mention is bias. And there's actually been a lot more research done on this in the last 5 years or so, but any system, how you train it with information is just as important as to the accuracy of the information and what information you put in. So for example, if you've got a program in say the healthcare space, right? And you want to use it in order to sort of diagnose patients with a certain type of disease. If you, let's say you have a very diverse data set, right? So you've got, women, men, Black, white, Hispanic as part of the overall data set. But if the first thing that you train the system on is here's what 100 women, white women have as far as the disease goes, right? The training is already set in a manner that you can't undo that, right? Because it's not it's linear, right? And so when you add the next set, which is say 100 black women on top of that, right? That's on top of it. So it doesn't unlearn what it learned and integrate with the 100 white women, right? What it's doing is that it's taking the information that it already has and it's revising what it has. It's not analyzing it in the way it should, right? And so there's now a lot more information out there and a lot more thought leadership around. Yes, you can have a diverse set of information. You can verify its accuracy, so you got the most accurate information. But how you actually go about the training is just as important to the information that you have.
Got it. All right. Well, I certainly appreciate all that, and that I think provides a much better understanding for certainly for me in understanding how all these systems work. But each of you raised an issue that I know is been a frequent question that I've gotten about AI, and it stems off the kind of the human analogy that you've been making, pushing the envelope and neural networks being human-like and the ease of use and how simple it is and how you can write papers for all of this. And although you mentioned some of the historical weaknesses about training, also mentioned that it's folks are getting much better at addressing those issues to make it more unbiased. But it does all of that raise the questions like this is mimicking human behavior to an extent, but in additional ways, it's providing new techniques, new methodologies that humans really can't do very efficiently. So the question is a natural one: is what's the impact on humans going to be? Will AI really replace humans? Is that something we really need to be worried about? I mean, I don't want to talk about the T-2000, but whatever the Terminator robot was, but is that kind of Skynet future ahead of us, or is that really just not something we need to be concerned about? Jason, you want to start with you?
Yeah, I mean, look, any time over history, right? There have been sort of uh, significant leaps in technological advances, right? You can go back to like the steam engine, right? And then you think about how, I'm in the 90s, right? I didn't have a cell phone. And so when I was in college, right? And so, I think this sort of generative AI is another potential leap, but I think we're still really in the infancy as to what it can do. But I think in general, artificial intelligence is going to take over certain aspects of sort of the human everyday work experience. I think that some of that's to the betterment, right? I mean, it does make things easier on us. It also will help us capture and identify, threats to health or other things. I think in a better manner than human eyes. And so I definitely think that there are, advantages, but ultimately I don't think we're anywhere near the Skynet days. I think where we're at is really trying to figure out where artificial intelligence is best suited to sort of help us as humans and as society in general, and making sure that we put effective guardrails around that, because there are always going to be bad actors, right? And I think artificial intelligence, I mean, look, there's cyber attacks daily, and there are lots of bad actors out there, and there's a lot of, you talk about in the last political cycle, right? So like the deep fakes, you got artificial intelligence that can mimic people's voices so it sounds like them. And so it is important that we ensure that bad actors can't use this to the detriment of the society in general, because I do think there's a lot of positives. And there aren't a lot of guardrails in place yet, right? And I think that the US in particular, from a federal perspective, right now it's all states that are trying to put in these laws to protect things. And so internationally, you've got a lot of other countries that are really on this. But I think, ultimately it's going to be like any other sort of like generational leap, right? There's going to be good and bad, and at some point, there are going to be things that are going to impact humans, like I mentioned the chatbot, right? And like the interaction on the customer service side. But certainly I don't think we're about to be taken over by the robots.
All right, Nate, I'm going to pass it over to you. Jason is suggesting that this is more of a productivity tool. It'll increase productivity, push, if you're an economist, pushing you into a more efficient marketplace where very similar. I think my analogy would be the days of the horse and buggy. When the car showed up, there was a dramatic change in that marketplace for horse and buggies to the car, similarly from ships to planes. And he's I did not put words in your mouth, Jason, but is essentially arguing that that's what's going to happen with AI. Skynet, far off in the distance, maybe not even a real threat. Neda, do you agree?
I do agree with that. And actually, I think last year Harvard Business Review had a really great article where they said AI is not going to replace humans, but humans with AI are going to replace humans without AI. And I think that that spoke a lot to what Jason is saying, which that I think is really going to be used as a tool to augment a lot of the work that we do, but it cannot replace human intelligence. And a lot of that for me goes back to the idea that AI is not forward thinking. It can't look ahead. It can only do what we teach it to do. And so as we advance, will advance with us, but I think that still puts human intelligence at the forefront of it. And so for me, AI is really a tool that can help us achieve our goals. And it's important that AI systems are created responsibly and ethically, and that we push for more transparency and understand all of the risks and limitations, but also that we see its potential and that how it can move our society forward to do these really complex things so much faster, so much quicker, and all the benefits that that brings in different industries.
Well, I certainly love the optimism from both of you. That's great. And both of you now have hinted a little bit about the risks of AI. And it sounds like because it is so new, the impact is still evolving. Regulators are having a bit of a tough time trying to figure out how to put any clear rules in place. So that sounds a bit of a risk. But Nita, how about I stick with you for a second? Could you walk us through some more at a high level, at least? What are the risks of AI that folks should be thinking about?
Yeah, so there's a couple of risks we've identified together. And one of the big ones that I think is important is the beware of the hype train. So the hype train being around narratives surrounding ChatGPT, talking about its capabilities with the idea that it can replace a lot of what we do. The reality is that AI is actually just useless without human supervision. We still need to double check everything that it does. As lawyers, especially, I think a lot of us have become very aware of the case that happened last year in New York when lawyers submitted a brief to the court and did not check whether those cases were real. In that way, ChatGPT probably created a very good brief, but none of the cases cited in it were real. And so still having that piece of human intelligence to look at and check and make sure those are still things that we need to do. Another big risk is the unknown unknowns. We don't know the breadth of what a generative AI capability is yet. We're still learning that with the new programs that are coming out, the new systems. Also, ChatGPT is not the only generative AI systems. There are other systems that are becoming more popular now. And so just getting to know more of the different types of generative AI and their capabilities, that's going to be very important. And then also thinking about as employees how we're using AI in our day to day. I sort of spoke about it before, but just being able to use ChatGPT to write a brief or to answer a question doesn't mean that that question is correct. You still have to be able to go check it. You have to keep in mind the privilege and confidentiality aspects of it. Make sure that you're protecting client information, make sure that you're doing your job as an attorney and not just that, but across industries to make sure whatever is being put into AI that we're still checking all of its work because the reality is that these are still programs created by human beings and it's not 100% accurate all of the time. Jason, did you want to also touch on some of the other potential risks?
Yeah, I mentioned already the bad actors. Cyber criminals are already becoming much more sophisticated before AI came out. But with the advent of generative AI, right, this is a tool now that cyber criminals can use to write even more realistic and convincing phishing emails. And we've already seen an uptick in this and use of that. And this is all open software, right? So remember, one of the things that people want to protect is confidentiality, right? So the information that you have, you don't want to put into a public generative AI tool, right? Because then that becomes public information and potentially gets spit out to someone who actually asks a question that's related to that. But this, open software that they can create their own internal networks on and train their own information on. And so, these bad actors can actually generate their own better versions of their own, phishing attacks based on the information and their own experiences. And so certainly, I think the bad actor side of this is something to keep aware of. But the opposite of that is, you can't bury your head in the sand, right? You can't just say, AI is bad. I don't know what it is. I don't know, how to make it work. I'm just going to ignore it, because what that's going to do is it's going to make your company and your employees and everyone fall behind the competition, right? So AI is here. And I think this is probably one of the reasons that it's a good idea to do a podcast like this, Paul, is to really sort of educate folks that, it's just software, right? There's a way to use it, and there's a way to use it responsibly. And it's important to come up with a mechanism to use artificial intelligence as part of your company's business or internal practices. And so, because if you don't, everyone else is, you're going to fall behind. So I know we've sort of put a lot of bad spin on artificial intelligence and made it sound like, there's all these problems with it, and there is, but people are moving forward with it, and it's important that companies understand that you should be involved in this. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity for companies to be at the forefront of something, and I don't think a lot of opportunities like this come along where you can be at sort of the beginning of this, a revolution, so to speak. And there is still very little out there on laws and regulations and people trying to figure this out. So why not be part of the conversation and help figure this out, and use it as an opportunity?
Well, that may I don't think that you've hyped up the negatives of it that much, Jason. So so don't worry about that. I take your thoughts as well as Neda's earlier comment about, there's a person or a company without AI, and then there's a company or a person with AI, and the person and company with AI might have some additional enhancements or benefits because of using this technology. And I think that's kind of where we're going with this right now, is people are trying to figure out the best way of using it in their particular industries. And if you don't mind, I'd like to take this moment really to kind of pivot to the transportation side of this and the impact that is having on this. There have been plenty in the marketplace that have been talking about the changes that all of this has brought as a revolution in the transportation space. And depending on what your definition of revolution is, I would tend to agree. But at a minimum, it is having a remarkable impact on this industry, on how data can be used on a variety of different levels to increase efficiencies and increase safety, and to provide new approaches to the old way of doing things. And if I can share just a few of them, I mean, the instant one that comes to mind in the transportation space, I know you came to your mind too, is autonomous vehicles, is the ability to have vehicles navigate roads, recognize objects, and make real-time decisions with passengers in them, passengers who may not be able to drive themselves legally, either because they're too old or maybe with some impairments. That will happen because of the benefits of AI. Traffic management, smart traffic systems, incident detections. These are part of our data gathering in cities now. You can gather data that allows these systems to better regulate traffic flow. And if something does happen along the roads, for that system to notify humans so they can react to it. A similar one is fleet management. Predictive maintenance. You've got these large trucking remains one of the largest employers in the United States, if not the largest employer of people in the United States. And they've got massive amounts of vehicles that they need to maintain and repair. And so predictive maintenance on these vehicles can be a huge cost savings for these fleets, as can route optimization. We've all got Waze or Google Maps or these other things, and the ability to plug into these systems in real time and suggest that the route I've always taken is actually not the most efficient one, either because of time or fuel. That's a big deal. There's also specific things within the aviation, maritime, and even the railway space where the aviations have AI in flight operations or air traffic controls, maritime transportation, autonomous ships, and port operations, railways with predictive analytics to monitor tracks and signals and stocks, rolling stock for maintenance roads, passenger insights, just how AI personalize the ticketing and improve service delivery. All of that is an effort to either improve efficiency, and in many cases, and I think the biggest selling point for AI in the transportation industry is enhancing safety. reducing human error. Now, I'm not suggesting it'll reduce it to zero, but given the amount of the more than a million, almost 1.5 million deaths on roads from traffic related incidents worldwide, certainly AI can minimize or reduce the amount of human error that's taking place either through mistakes, exhaustion, drunk driving, all of these things. If we remove that element, we can save a whole lot of people on that and a whole other scale. So that's some of the stuff that's happening in the transportation industry. And I'm honestly just scratching the surface here, but there's a lot to unpack. A lot to unpack. Did you, Jason? You raised your hand during that. I know our guests can't see that, but you might have a question about all that.
Yeah, I'm curious, Paul, in the transportation industry as well, and this really goes back to your sort of IP hat that you wear. Um, one thing that I hear, right, is that artificial intelligence is actually helping companies and entities actually solve problems, which could lead to, new IP. I'm curious, I guess is that something that you're seeing, and how should folks be, I guess, thinking about use of AI around IP, and sort of correlate to that, and I guess B is are you seeing sort of a silo effect where the information and the development is really sort of housed within, companies at this point, as opposed to sort of more general information and advancements that the technology industry can use in general? Meaning, is this more of a competitive landscape than sort of a collaborative landscape when it comes to sort of IP?
It's a great question, and it's such a good question, and it covers such a wide front of land there that it might be it might actually be good to be a separate cast entirely. But so two answers to your two-part question really is one, absolutely, intellectual property protection is a real concern for players in the space. You've got the platform developers, and so these are the people that gather the data, train the system, and then provide it for others to use. How they look at protection might be through patent, trade secret, copyrights, trademark, and the traditional bucket of rights. And then you have the users of these platforms or users of the algorithms who are asking the prompts and are getting interesting answers and are using that information to further their business or to further their idea. They too are facing, how do I use the plethora of IP rights to protect what I think I've just done? And increasingly, patent protection is a little tricky in this space. Patents do not historically or do not protect mathematical equations. They do not protect natural phenomena. And so there are limits to how far patents can go in protecting this type of technology when it is algorithmic based. So people are struggling with that and trying to figure out the best approach. A big issue right now, we've been talking about the entire cast, is how important the data is to training these models. And the more data you have, typically, the better your system will run. But where is this data coming from? There's a wildly great repository of information called the internet where people can draw a lot of stuff from because the data is readily available. But do they have permission to do that? Are there rights to that? Copyright rights mostly to that information that makes it a little challenging, if not prohibitive, for people to use pictures or data sets or all the information that you're talking about that one would use to want to train their system. And there are active lawsuits addressing that very issue right now. And the law is trying to come to terms with those issues, the rights of the right holders and the benefits of this new fledgling industry. What should be the rules of the road on that are still being worked out as we speak. So all of that is kind of underway right now. So, and I don't want to go into too much detail because Jason, frankly, I'd like you to host the next one where you get to ask me some more questions about this. But those are real concerns about not preventing people from using the technology, but having done so, how can I prevent others from riding on my coattails?
It's interesting just to kind of follow up on the data point, right? And you kind of, again, you see this across the industry. I mean, part of the challenge with any type of AI model is not only gathering the information, but making sure that it's the type of information that you want and that it's accurate, right? And so, because yes, you can definitely scour the internet for data, but I think this sort of idea of data brokers is becoming a bigger sort of topic. And similar to where, in the IP litigation space, where a patent troll for a long time was, this one guy with a bunch of patents and working out of a shop and like suing everybody. I mean, at some point it switched, right? I mean, Apple became a patent troll when it sued Samsung, right? Because all the IP that it was asserting against Samsung, it wasn't in their phones, it wasn't in their technology, right? And so one could call that a troll. I think that's kind of where we're going to the data in the data space, right? I think you've got a lot of different players that have information that they've gathered from various sources, and they're realizing that they can monetize this. And so I do think you're going to start seeing a lot more of that sort of commoditization by bigger companies and entities when it comes to the data sets, because everyone's going to be looking for trusted sources, right, of information in order to make sure that when they train their model, it's a reliable product, it's a reliable output, which ultimately, I would assume in the transportation space is probably, as you mentioned on the safety side, a very big deal, right? Because you want it to be able to make the right decisions in the right manner. And so having that sort of data and, verifiable data, I think is going to be really important. So
Couldn't agree more. And I certainly envision a world where, and it's not that far off, where users of this technology, you mentioned, let's stick with the driving cars for a second, where the manufacturer of these cars will want to actively encourage you to give them the data that you create on your ordinary rides. And so just like when you go to a new website and you say, it says, do you consent to getting all the cookies or not? And I'm sure there's some stats out there that show a great percentage just say accept. And that's the way it happens. That might be a part of the driving experience when you get in these cars, that you agree that the information is going to be used. And because the reality is the country, the system, the company, whatever it is that has the most data, the most good data, they may very well have the better product as a result. And so we want to and probably want to encourage the use of this data, because it will make all of our products a lot better. Listen, but a lot to unpack there. Looking for AI part two, but I did want to touch on at least one other aspect of this, because I know you both uh, work in the regulatory space with AI, and want to kind of end on that particular topic. Jason, you've already foreshadowed some of this. Sounds like feds are still really struggling on a national level. States have gotten much more involved. If I could start with you, and in broad strokes, or as broad as you'd like, tell us about the regulatory frameworks in the United States right now to govern AI and its use.
yeah, and some of this is AI specific, but a lot of it is not currently, right? So, and I'm actually going to go back to what you mentioned around, the driver or the user of the technology providing the data over, right? So there already exists at the state level multiple states that have data privacy laws, personal data privacy laws. And so, collection of use of that information is actually subject to those laws. And so, in order to collect and gather the information from the users, right, they need to comply with those laws. And I know that there have been some instances where, collection of information has been challenged in those circumstances, right? Because, if the car comes to you with everything already checked as accepted, right, when you buy the car, instead of having to go through the process of, accepting it, there have been challenges on the legal and the regulatory front, right? So the collection of the data itself is already subject to a data privacy framework, mainly at the state level. At the federal level, we're going to see what's going to happen under the new Trump administration, right? Under the Biden administration, the FTC, particularly under Khan, was very active and aggressive against companies for collecting and using information they were improperly. They were also very active against artificial intelligence companies for disclosing, what it is the use and collection of the information was and how they were using data for artificial intelligence. But also in the back end, right? When you've got the data, what have you done with it? Are you giving it over to third parties and to other partners, and how are they using it, right? So it remains to be seen what that federal enforcement arena is going to be like under the new administration. Is something to watch. But you're right, we don't have a federal law that talks about artificial intelligence. We don't have a federal law that talks about data privacy. And then on the artificial intelligence side, very briefly, again, this is all being filled in by states, and they're kind of all over the place with the various ways that they're trying to address this. Some are really in the weeds around use of employee information by employers for particular purposes. States right? How states are employing artificial intelligence in their own practice across the various government agencies. New York just recently passed one of those. Actually, this week, it was signed into law by Kathy Hochul. So, and then it goes back to the sort of the insurance related ones, right? Like use of information that you're collecting on an artificial intelligence basis, giving it over to insurance companies, right? So they can use them for decisions. But again, it's sort of a mishmash, right? And it makes it really difficult for companies to put into place sort of a comprehensive best practices compliance regime, right? And so I think companies are also struggling with this. Um, but any company working internationally, Europe right now is the gold standard, right? They have the EU AI Act, which is going to come in on board the next couple of years. And so whether or not the U.S. is going to land there, I don't know. But certainly, there are countries and groups around the world that already have AI laws and regulations. And so any company working internationally, at this point, putting into place whatever those countries require are likely, and then likely adding on like, whatever the state specific laws that would impact them is going to be the way to go. But it is not a fun time to try to figure out how to comply.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. And it certainly sounds from a policy matter, the U.S. is almost purposely taking a hands-off approach to let the industry develop a little bit. But maybe I'm missing that. But Neda, did you have anything to add there?
On the regulatory framework, just building on what Jason said, because we've talked so much about autonomous vehicles, just also noting that so many states have also put in place their own autonomous vehicles rules and regulations. So there's a couple of big ones like in Arizona, New York, Michigan, California, Kentucky. A lot of states are looking at law enforcement interaction plans, how a lot of these autonomous vehicles will interact with law enforcement if there are any safety concerns on the road. Thinking also about just the testing, the permits that are in place, the insurance requirements. A lot of the rules for each state are there is no uniform rules, so every state has its own set of rules. So if companies are operating and testing different autonomous vehicles in different places, there is different types of regulations they need to look at to follow. So just building on everything Jason said to also focus on that. And then I guess also adding that with those rules, there's also very high penalties in place for not following them. So states like New York, for example, has a penalty of $5,000 per day for testing an AV without a permit. So on top of that, there's also a requirement for substantial insurance coverage. You need to have $5 million for insurance coverage for automobiles, 3 million for personal liability, 2 million property damage. There's a lot of different very high penalty costs, very high insurance costs. So just companies keeping those in mind as they move at looking at which states they want to operate and test their autonomous vehicles in.
Well, it's a great point, and it's what I hear from that. Interesting. I think it's more of a half full approach than half empty. Is that yeah, the states are figuring their way out right now. There is a mishmash of them. They have different rules and requirements reflecting the different policy concerns that each state may have given their circumstances. But the fact that these laws are coming online indicates to me that there's a real understanding that this technology is coming, and they want it moderated. They want to protect people. They want to control it to some extent, but that states are coming to terms with the fact that this technology is may very well be coming to a town near us. Any closing thoughts here from Neda, from you? I'll start with you, and then Jason, turn to you. But as we've gone through a very interesting conversation here about understanding AI and its implications in the industry, any last thoughts that you would like to share?
We've covered a lot. I guess for me, I'll just end on a positive note. I think AI has a lot of potential. I'm really looking forward to how the world changes over the next 5 years. We're in a new year. I'm looking forward to even this year alone, what moves forward. It's something that has, come quickly. It's come fast. It's hit every industry. And just to see it continuing to develop, I think is something that makes a lot of people nervous, but is also something that we can look forward to.
Jason?
Yeah, I echo what Netta said, and I think there is a lot of exciting opportunities in with the use of artificial intelligence, but also this is a great opportunity for stakeholders from across industries to come together and to really level set on priorities when it comes to use of artificial intelligence, because ultimately for these products to benefit the general public has to have a belief and a trust in it. And I think at this point, that belief and trust is really not coming from federal and state governments per se, but it's going to really have to come from sort of the stakeholders in the various industries getting together collectively to set some boundaries so that these products can move forward and then be useful for the general population.
Well, I appreciate all of that, and exciting time to even be a Crowell with professionals like you who can help clients walk through these issues. And I'm going to put that as a bit of a prediction from both of you, optimistic predictions for 2025. Look forward to catching up with you either later at the end of this year or early next to revisit those predictions and see what the year has unfolded for us. But thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us at And Motion, Crowell and Moring's podcast addressing all things transportation related.
This episode of And Motion is brought to you by Crowell and Mooring LLP. To learn more about this series, visit crowell.com/podcasts.